We used part of the lesson week before last and then all of last week's lesson to get a refresher course on Esther, because it's 10 chapters, and sometimes it does kind of lose you how the account unfolds, because there are, as we mentioned last week, some twists and turns in it. But since we've summarized now through all of the book, it's now time to get down to, for however long that we deal with it in the class, some actual thoughts that come up of a practical nature. Because again, these books don't have a lot of doctrinal information, but they do have a lot of practical information. So for such a time as this, and that brings up kind of the element of providence, which we spoke of time before last. So now in thinking about it, let's think about all of the different types of times that come up in Esther. Chapter 4, let's look in verses 1 through 8. As Esther chapter 4 and verses 1 through 8. So what was it a time for in Esther chapter 4, verses 1 through 8? Time for what? Decisions, yes. So in chapter 4, what takes place? What has to be done? Chapter 4, what's taking place? So Mordecai tells Esther that if she doesn't act, what will take place? They're going to be killed, including her. So there was this time for these decisions. You get down in verses 13 and 14, and that's specifically where those decisions were made. Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you'll escape in the king's palace any more than all of the other Jews, so you will regrettably die as well. If you remain completely silent at that time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews for another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Do you have moments in your life where it's time for far-reaching decisions? And I don't mean far-reaching decisions about, things like retirement and where your kids are going to go to college. I mean for you spiritually, do you have times in your life that are far-reaching decisions? What are some of those times? The person that you marry. I mean, other than the decision to become a Christian or not, if we just went ahead and said, let's make that decision to become a Christian, then right off the bat, it's going to be who you decide to marry. What else is going to be a far-reaching decision? Where you live. Because there's lots and lots of places in the world that are wonderful to live, but what? Spiritually, they're very, very tough. There's no body of saints. There's no encouragement there. Some places are pretty secular. So deciding where to be in life and then subsequently what to do with your life is another very, very far-reaching decision. Now let's think about some decisions that are less monumental. What about far-reaching decisions just at work? This happened several years ago, but it happened at a congregation here in town. It was probably 15 years ago or so. And they were having a Bible class on marriage. And I've done a Bible class on marriage a couple of times through. So this other congregation in town decided that they were going to do that. And someone who works somewhere in town decided to ask one of the people that they worked with, and they said, it's a marriage class, and most people would tell you that even if their marriage is good, they can always what? They can always learn different things. They can just be reminded of things. Oh, I need to do, I need to do that for Jeannie more. I need to show her more appreciation in this way or that way, cleaning up the house, things like that. It's all these little bitty things that tend to compound and make a really good marriage. So she invited her friends at work. They came to the marriage class. They started studying, and lo and behold, they became Christians. And the last that I asked, which wasn't terribly long ago, they were still faithful at this congregation in town. So then let's turn that into a far-reaching decision. Because not only does husband and wife obey the gospel, but then what do you have the potential for? You have the potential for the children. And then the children can what? The children can obey the gospel. I haven't made a big deal about this because I hate it that I don't. It's not as important to me. It just isn't. But Grayson's starting to really get into it. So through some different books and talking to my brother, who is really, really into it, Grayson's found out. So has anyone ever heard of Raccoon John Smith? Okay. Grayson and I are related to him. And so as we started working it back, he is, I might miss this by a generation because Grayson and I have talked. So let me tell it from Grayson's point of view. Raccoon John Smith is Grayson's great, 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 great grandfather. And I don't say that to trade off of the name. We're 5 generations of Christians. So Grayson and I are generation 5 and 6 of all of these Christians. And that was because all of these generations ago, somebody decided what? To be a Christian, to obey the gospel. And you wonder, well, me and my wife, we're trying to decide if we're going to obey, and let's go ahead and do it. I mean, we're really convinced of it, and we think it'll make life better, and we definitely want to hope for eternity. When I tell people, and I don't go into it all of this, but I thought I'd at least share this with you. When you decide to raise your children, when you decide to help with your grandchildren and try to instill spiritual values and try to talk to them about obeying the gospel, you literally could be acting for a far-reaching decision for someone for generations. And I know that because I'm in the generations. A lot of generations. I mean, when Raccoon John Smith goes back prior to the Civil War. So you can have that kind of family. But it means some far-reaching decisions. Now was a time for Esther in a far-reaching decision. So you need it in your family. But you might think, I work with this person, and we brought up some spiritual decisions. We've brought up some spiritual talks every once in a while. Maybe I'll invite him to the loop. Well, look at what a far-reaching decision that could possibly be. And you're nervous. You're kind of scared to bring it up. Everyone is. But when you take that step, it could be a big, big step for someone. For such a time as this. Now is maybe the time to do it. Now's the time for life-threatening choices. I mean, in 9 through 12, why didn't she want to do it? The king might reject her, and that could have meant that she's deposed, like what happened to Vashti, or it could even mean what? That maybe she was killed. And without proof positive evidence, I don't want to say that every decision has the absolute most drastic outcome, but she most definitely could have been deposed. We saw that with Vashti, who refused. And now you're left with so this is a time for a life-threatening decision. If it doesn't end your life, it could radically change your life. Now, it radically changed her life for the better. And now is the time for it. Our lives from the beginning, from the time that we reach adulthood until the time that we die, our lives are filled with tens of thousands of decisions. I mean, just think about in a year's time how many decisions that you have to make. Very, very few of them are either life-threatening or maybe a better word could have been a life-changing moment. But Esther was willing to make the decision when she could. And it always, of course, ended up eternally to her benefit. It was time for boldness. So Esther chapter 4, verse 16. So let me read verse 16. Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for these 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So this was her time for boldness. She was accepting that maybe this decision could bring about the most drastic of consequences. But it was time for her to be bold. So how important is boldness? How important is boldness? Okay, so it is very important because God doesn't want us to live in any kind of fear. So put it in a practical way. Let's say that, and preachers have to deal with this, elders have to deal with this, families have to deal with it, even people who just are caring people, they have to deal with this. So you see someone spiritually, and they're just hanging by a thread, okay? And that means boldness because you've got to say something. So now I'm kind of running down through some of these moments in Esther's life. If I say nothing, will they get any better? If I don't say anything, the likelihood of someone getting better, spiritually hanging by a thread, the likelihood of someone getting better is very, very what? It's very, very low. Very, very low. Why not? Well, you could change that from a spiritual application into all different kinds of physical applications, and the answer would still be the same. If I say nothing, the likelihood of them improving will be almost non-existent. But if I'm bold and I jump at the chance, I seize the opportunity, and whether that opportunity is, boy, just right in your face, or it's more gentle, if I seize the opportunity, then what about my likelihoods of changing? They went up dramatically. So think about this when you're trying to help someone, and whether it's of a spiritual nature or whether you're thinking about someone trying to help someone physically in another way, because I think it would apply most of the time, but you're just going to have to be the one to have the discernment. If you do nothing, nothing's going to change. That's the general rule. If you do nothing, nothing's going to change. If you do something, you what? You increase it. You've got a chance. You've got a chance. I would love it if we could always change everything that's incomplete in our life, but we can't. But if you'll do it, there's a chance. Right. Right. With the use of confidence and faith, and that confidence and faith then builds someone else up to try to do and to try to accomplish better things. And that is a good point. And it's kind of the same point that Esther ran into. Remember, if you want to try to change something, you're going to have to act. You're going to be the one to have the discretion as to how to do that acting. But if you want something to change, you're going to have to act. Because if you leave it alone, it just won't what? Nothing will change. Nothing will change. That's just a leadership principle. Use it in the church, use it in your job, because it's still going to apply in your job. Doesn't matter where you are. Okay. It is a time for life-preserving action. So in chapter 7 and chapter 8, when we went through this, in these verses, chapter 7 verses 3 through 6, chapter 8 verses 3 through 6, what did the Jews have to do? What did the Jews have to do? This is not even Esther. What did the Jews have to do? What did the Jews have to do in chapter 7 and chapter 8? They were going to be what? They were going to be destroyed. So Esther rallies for them. And what does Esther do? She couldn't get the law changed, which would have been ideal. This was the way that the Medes and the Persian government was just set up. She couldn't get the law changed. But what could she do? She could get another law that said Jews could defend themselves. The Jews had to what? They had to fight. When the time came in chapter 7 and chapter 8, what did they have to do? They had to fight. When the Persians came for them, ready to annihilate them, because let's face it, that was the law. They had to what? They had to fight. And they had to kill thousands of them. So I'll say this. It is easy to talk a talk. If we did have someone who broke into her house, or we did have someone who had broken into the church, or if we did have someone who had broken into the school and was going to do someone harm, there's lots of people who are very, very full of bravado who would say what? They're dead. I'm killing them. When you talk to people who have actually done that, not a lot of, at least not that I've found. If your experience is different, then tell me. I've not found a lot of police officers who've had to shoot and kill people. But I've run across a lot of Vietnam War veterans who've had to kill dozens of people. And they all say the same thing. And guess what they say? You never, ever get over it. Never get over. I'm talking about people men who went as kids when they were 18, and I'm talking to them like several years ago, when they're 75. And 55 years later, they're saying, you just never get over it. No rational, sane person would want to kill someone else. But these Jews had to do it, or else they were going to die. And this, when you put this as a life-preserving action, again, you think that I could do it, just let me at it. It's probably harder than a lot of people think when you're the one behind the spear, or as it would be today, when you're the one behind the gun. It would probably be a lot harder than you think. But they had to what? They had to do it. They had to do it if they were going to preserve themselves. Not easy, and probably never got over it. But ending this little point on a happy note, it was also a time in chapter 9 for what? A celebration. And why was it a time for a celebration? Why celebrate? Okay, so obviously for victory. They were still alive, but why else celebrate? Because who had done it? God had done it. God provided the what? God provided the means. In fact, in just a second, you'll see why I'm saying this. God opened the door for them to do what? save themselves. God opened the door for them to save themselves. And that was worth commemorating in a feast. So what's the feast called? Feast of Purim. And it was called Purim. Why? That was a Persian word for lots. So guess what? Yesterday, again, I'm not joking, look on your phone. Yesterday was Yom Kippur. When we get to March of next year-ish, guess what that'll be? Guess what that'll be? It'll be the Feast of Purim. Because the Jews have had it every single year for now 2,500 years or so. And if you'll do us, God, may not be on your, it may not be recognized as a high enough event to actually warrant a calendar entry. But trust me, in somewhere in March and April of next year, it's always in the spring, there's going to be a Feast of Purim. So this was something that the Jews have held as important to them for a long time. And there are times when we need to celebrate the fact that God has opened doors for us, which leads us to the last point that we'll consider in Esther, and that is just open doors. So Acts chapter 14, verse 27, the first time that I'm aware of where it's mentioned, in Acts chapter 14, verse 27, what does Acts chapter 14, verse 27 say? So when a door is open, you've just got to what? You've just got to go in it. you just got to go in it. When the door is open, you go into it. Here we're talking about, of course, in a spiritual way. Like I said, a lot of these things that we'll say over the next few minutes are going to apply to your life with your children and raising your children. A lot of it's going to apply to your work life and trying to do well and excelling in your work life. It all works together. There was an open door. In this sense, God had opened the door where? As this kind of first missionary journey, as it's often called, is coming down to an end, then they are celebrating that God had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. Door of faith is opened. What do we need to do? We need to go through it. Let's look in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and the 9th verse. 1 Corinthians 16 and the 9th verse. It says that he had mentioned in verse 8, "But I will tarry in Ephesus until Pentecost, for a great and effective door has opened to me, and there are many adversaries." But he stays there for what reason? Because he's got opportunity. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, and we look in verse 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, and looking in verse 12. And this is the beginning of a verse of actually a beautiful paragraph. This is one of these sections of Scriptures that a lot of times people actually do a lesson on this section because it's beautiful. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, starting in verse 14. "Furthermore, when I came to Troas to preach Christ's gospel," what was there? A door. A door was opened to me by the Lord. And as we keep on going, "I had no rest in my spirit because I did not find Titus my brother, but taking my leave of them, I departed for Macedonia." Paul wanted to hear from Titus because Titus was bringing tidings about the church in Corinth. Paul's writing them back saying, I wanted to hear from Titus. Titus didn't show up. They had no really easy means of communicating back then. So what did I do? I went on to Troas because there was a door that was open to me. But in verse 14, now thanks be to God who always leads us in triumph in Christ and through us diffuses the fragrance of His knowledge in every place. For we are to God the fragrance of Christ among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. To the one are the aroma of death leading to death, and to the other the aroma of life leading to life. And who is sufficient for these things? For we are not, as so many, peddling the word of God, but as of sincerity, but as from God we speak in the sight of God in Christ. The work that he was doing, whether you talk about it from Troas or whether you talk about his work with the Corinthians in correcting them, was an open door of opportunity. He takes the door in Troas. He can do a lot of good. But he also takes the door of sending Titus to the Corinthians to try to correct them. That door ended up being effective. And so whether he's talking about primarily Troas, which I think he is, or he's talking about the Corinthians, because it would still also apply, we are, in what we do, leading other people in triumph in Christ. It's an old image of a Roman general that as they come back to Rome after being victorious, they have a parade, just like people who win the big sporting events. Whoever's going to win the World Series in a month or so is going to come home to this welcoming parade. Well, the Roman general came back to this welcoming parade, and they would bring spoils. They would also bring the captives. And you could hear the whole city was getting ready for this feast. For the people who were victorious, it was an aroma of life unto life. For the captives, who may have been put in prison for a long time or might have even have lost their lives or been sold off, it was an aroma of what? Of death unto death. So Paul had these open doors. We have to use them. But we need to also, in Colossians chapter 4, verse 3, do what? We need to pray for them. We need to pray for them. Because God does what? God answers prayers. God answers prayers. I brought up before in sermons that the future of the church everywhere is positive or negative? Why is it negative? Why is the future of the Lord's church negative? Satan's always at work. Just looking at trends, what is happening to the world? And I don't mean war and stuff like that. What's happening to the population of the world? It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but it's also getting what? Two things. It's getting older and older and older. Birth rates all over the world are doing what? Going down. So the world's getting older in its population distribution. So what's going to happen to churches in the future? Every church I've ever seen is made up at least of 50% of older Christians. As those die, what's going to happen to churches in the future? They're going to decline, and some of them aren't going to make it. And there can be problems in a specific church. A specific church can be in a bad location, but no one can get around just the demographics of the next few decades. I mean, you can't erase it because it is what's going to happen unless something pretty monumental changes. So that makes the outlook for the Lord's body dimmer than we would have hoped. What do we need to be doing? We need to be praying for what? For open doors. And when we get those open doors, what do we need to do? We need to go through them. Yeah, we need to go through them. Let's look at this in Ephesians chapter 5, and we look in verse 16. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 16. What does Ephesians chapter 5 verse 16 say? Okay, and in verse 5, we are walking in what way? We are walking in what way in verse 15? Oh, I'm sorry. In verse 15, how are we walking? Circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. So, what does walking circumspectly mean? It means carefully. It means diligently. What does circumspectly, circumference, what does that mean, circumspectly? You're looking at what? Trying to look at everything, trying to look all around. So in walking circumspectly, we're trying to take in what? Trying to take in everything. And as we take in everything, we're trying to make the best decisions that we can. Walking as wise, not as fools. We've got decisions like this all of the time. We get kind of locked in and we think we only take in like one factor. And in one factor we make this big decision, a big life decision. But what catches us are all of the other factors that weigh into the decision too. So when you make a decision based off of one factor, that's not walking what? Circumspectly. Oh, for example, you take a job only because it offers a lot of money. That's one factor. It's an important factor. I don't mean to discount that. But you have to think what? There's a lot of other factors that can make that truly a hideous experience. But if you don't take in all of that factors, you're going to jump in, and what might happen? You end up with the horrible experience. So walking circumspectly just means that you take in everything, you look all around, redeeming the days, redeeming your time, because these days are evil, and this is what we have to do. We use our opportunities, and then just lastly, what do we need to be doing? Looking for more. Looking for more. I've always been convinced that God gives opportunities. And to the people who take advantage of those opportunities, God does what? He gives them more. The people who don't take advantage of the opportunities, what does God do? If you think about it biblically, would God take them away and give them to someone who would use them? Jim, and I just speak about this from a preaching perspective. Jim and I have opportunities to study with people. In fact, I will say this, it's feast or famine. Some years are good, some years aren't as good. But if those opportunities just keep coming along, and I think, well, the only time that I have to study is this time that's really inconvenient for me, so they probably wouldn't have obeyed anyway, so I'm just going to kind of walk away from it and look for the next one. If I just keep deprecating all of my opportunities, guess what's going to happen? God's not going to give me any more opportunities because I'm not what? I'm not using them. I'm not capitalizing on the opportunities that I have. But if we can do what we can to pray for them, to use them, and then, because like Esther, you've gotten bolder to then actually go out and look for more. It's just like in Acts chapter 8, verse 40. This is after the Ethiopian eunuch was converted. What does the Spirit do with Philip? Carries him off, presumably to what? Keep taking advantage of those opportunities. Esther, believe it or not, is a wonderful book that has a lot of practical lessons to it that we've gotten the chance to take advantage of. But don't forget, maybe the most overarching of all of the lessons in the book is the lesson of open doors and what we can learn from that. Next time we're going to go back into Ezra as time moves on in ancient history. Now we go back into Ezra in Ezra chapter 7 because that's where Ezra is going to go back to the land of Palestine. So read Ezra 7 through 10. We will summarize that and talk about trembling at the Word of God.